Henry Marsh stood in his Montana cabin, staring at $400 worth of rotted meat hanging from the ceiling beams. The venison had turned green in places, the elk quarters covered in white mold that spread like frost across the surface. 3 months of hunting, smoking, and careful preparation destroyed in less than 2 weeks of unexpected heat. What Henry discovered in his desperate search for a solution would change how settlers, trappers, and homesteaders stored food across the entire western frontier for the next 50 years. Before we dive into how Henry solved one of the frontier's deadliest problems, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by forgotten survival innovations that changed history, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's story involves a technique so simple you'll wonder why nobody thought of it sooner. The year was 1839. The Rocky Mountain fur trade had peaked and declined, but the mountains still drew men willing to risk everything for independence and profit. Henry Marsh was one of these men, though he had arrived later than the legendary trappers whose names would fill history books. He had come west in 1836 at age 24 from Pennsylvania, where his family farmed rocky hillside land that barely produced enough to survive. The mountains offered something his father's exhausted farm never could: the possibility of actual prosperity. Henry was not a famous mountain man. He would never scout for the army or guide wagon trains or have his exploits recorded in dime novels. He was competent, careful, and fortunate enough to avoid the accidents and encounters that killed so many others. He trapped beaver when he could find them, hunted elk and deer for meat and hides, and traded his goods at the annual rendezvous gatherings where trappers met supply caravans from St. Louis. He made enough to survive and save a little each year. His goals were modest: build up enough capital to start a small ranch eventually, maybe in Oregon Territory, where land was essentially free if you were willing to work it. His cabin was located in southwestern Montana near the confluence of 2 unnamed creeks that fed into the Ruby River. The location was remote even by mountain standards, which suited Henry perfectly. Fewer trappers meant less competition for game and fewer conflicts over territory. The isolation also meant Henry was entirely self-reliant. If something went wrong, there was nobody to help him. The nearest trading post was 4 days' ride to the northeast. Other trappers occasionally passed through the area, but Henry might go 6 weeks without seeing another human being. He had built his cabin in the summer of 1837 using standard methods: notched logs, mud chinking, a simple plank door, 1 small window covered with oiled paper, and a bark roof that leaked during heavy rain but kept out most weather. The structure was adequate. Inside, he had a stone fireplace he had built himself, a sleeping platform, a small table, shelves for supplies, and the ceiling beams from which he hung meat for smoking and storage. The setup was typical of bachelor trappers living alone in the wilderness. Food preservation was Henry's constant challenge, as it was for everyone on the frontier. Without preservation, meat spoiled within days during warm weather. Vegetables lasted only slightly longer. The growing season in the Montana mountains was short, roughly 4 months between late frosts. That meant 8 months of the year, Henry depended entirely on preserved food. He used every preservation method known to frontiersmen. He smoked meat over slow fires, creating a surface crust that slowed bacterial growth. He salted meat heavily, drawing out moisture that bacteria needed to multiply. He dried berries and edible roots in the sun. He stored some foods in containers submerged in the cold creek water near his cabin. Each method worked to some degree, but each had serious limitations. Smoking meat required constant attention and specific weather conditions. The process took days of maintaining low, steady heat while smoke permeated the meat's surface. If the fire got too hot, the meat cooked instead of curing. If the smoke stopped too soon, the preservation was incomplete. Rain could ruin an entire batch by introducing moisture that encouraged mold. Wind could blow embers into dried grass and start fires that threatened the entire camp. Henry had lost meat to all these problems at various times. Salting worked better but required salt, which was expensive and heavy to transport. At the trading posts, salt cost 50 cents per pound, and Henry needed 20 to 30 pounds per year to preserve adequate meat supplies. That represented a significant portion of his annual fur trading income. Heavy salting also made the meat nearly inedible without soaking it in fresh water for hours before cooking, which meant planning meals far in advance. The salt drew out so much moisture that the meat became hard as wood, requiring extended boiling to make it chewable. Drying worked well for some foods, but required hot, dry weather and protection from insects and animals. Flies laid eggs on drying meat within minutes of exposure. The resulting maggots could infest an entire batch before Henry noticed. Birds, squirrels, and other small animals would steal dried food if it was not constantly guarded or stored in sealed containers. Rain during the drying process meant starting over completely. In the mountains, weather changed unpredictably. A sunny morning could become a thunderstorm afternoon, destroying days of preparation work. Creek storage was Henry's most reliable method, but only worked during certain seasons. In spring and early summer, snowmelt kept the creek water cold enough to slow spoilage significantly. Henry had built a small underwater cache using a wooden box weighted with stones and submerged in a deep pool. Meat stored in this cache would last a week or more during cold water months. But by mid-July, the creek warmed considerably. Water that had been barely above freezing in May reached temperatures of 60 degrees or higher by late summer. At those temperatures, submerged meat spoiled almost as quickly as meat left in the cabin. The July heat wave of 1839 was unusually severe. Temperatures reached the high 90s for 12 consecutive days. Inside Henry's cabin, the temperature climbed past 85 degrees despite the thick log walls. The smoked meat hanging from his ceiling beams, which should have lasted through autumn, began deteriorating rapidly. The heat accelerated bacterial growth that even heavy smoking could not prevent. Within 10 days, meat that represented 3 months of hunting effort was completely spoiled. Henry had faced setbacks before, but this was catastrophic. It was late July. Hunting season for elk would not begin until September. The deer population in his area was sparse from overhunting by various trappers in previous years. He had perhaps 6 weeks of edible food remaining if he rationed carefully. After that, he would face a choice between dangerous emergency hunting in late summer when game was scarce, or making the 4-day journey to the trading post to purchase supplies at inflated prices that would consume most of his savings. Henry sat outside his cabin the evening after discovering the spoiled meat, trying to calculate his options. None of them were good. He could attempt to hunt despite the poor conditions, but summer hunting was notoriously difficult. Animals moved to higher elevations, seeking cooler temperatures and better forage. They were scattered and wary. A man could spend weeks in the high country and return with nothing. He could travel to the trading post, but purchasing enough preserved food to last until hunting season would cost at least $200, most of his accumulated savings. He could attempt to trap beaver intensively and trade the pelts for food, but beaver were scarce in his area now after years of heavy trapping. The next morning, Henry walked to his creek cache to retrieve the few items stored there that might still be edible. The cache was located in a deep pool where a large boulder diverted the current, creating a calm area with slower water. He waded into the pool, feeling the water temperature. It was noticeably warmer than it had been in June, warm enough that his submerged cache was probably useless now. He pulled up the wooden box. The meat inside had begun to spoil despite being underwater. He threw it onto the bank in disgust. As he stood in the creek, considering his situation, he noticed something odd. About 20 yards downstream, a beaver dam had partially collapsed during spring flooding and never been repaired. The beavers had apparently abandoned that particular dam and moved elsewhere. Where the dam breach had occurred, water had carved a channel through the bank, exposing a cross-section of earth several feet deep. Henry could see distinct layers in the exposed soil, topsoil, and plant roots near the surface, then a layer of darker organic material, then a band of reddish clay extending down as far as he could see into the bank. He walked over to examine the collapsed section more closely. The clay layer interested him because it reminded him of the clay deposits near his family's Pennsylvania farm. His father had always complained about clay soil being difficult to plow, but Henry remembered that the root cellar dug into clay always stayed remarkably cool, even during summer heat. He reached into the exposed bank and dug his hand into the clay layer. The clay felt cool to his touch, noticeably cooler than the air temperature or the surface soil. Henry dug deeper with his hands, pulling out chunks of the reddish clay. 6 inches into the bank, the clay was even cooler, a foot deep. It was cold enough that holding it in his hands for a minute made his fingers uncomfortable. He looked at the collapsed beaver dam, the exposed clay bank, and the warm creek water that could no longer preserve his food. Something about the cold clay triggered a memory of his father's root cellar back in Pennsylvania. That cellar had been dug deep into clay soil. Vegetables stored there lasted months. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, even some wrapped meats stayed fresh far longer than anything stored above ground. Henry spent the rest of that day thinking about the cold clay. He had no formal education in science or engineering. He did not know the physics of thermal mass or understand why Earth maintained stable temperatures below certain depths. What he did know from practical experience was that his father's root cellar had worked remarkably well, and that cellar had been dug into clay soil very similar to what he had just discovered near his creek. The connection seemed obvious once he made it. If clay stayed cold underground and cold temperatures prevented food spoilage, then perhaps he could dig his own cold storage area into the clay deposit near his cabin. The idea seemed almost too simple. Every trapper knew that caves stayed cool in summer. Some men stored food in natural caves when they could find them, but caves were rare and often occupied by bears or other animals that made them dangerous to use. What Henry was considering was essentially creating an artificial cave, a hole dug deep enough into clay soil to reach the cold zone he had felt when digging into the collapsed beaver bank. If it worked, he would have permanent cold storage that did not depend on creek water temperature or scarce natural caves. The next morning, Henry began his first experiment. He selected a spot about 30 yards from his cabin on a slight rise that would prevent water from pooling during heavy rain. The location was close enough to be convenient, but far enough that any digging would not undermine his cabin's foundation. He had a shovel, a basic tool that every frontiersman owned for various camp tasks. He had never used it for a project like this, but it would have to work. He started digging. The top layer of soil was easy, loose topsoil mixed with grass roots and organic material. He removed this quickly, piling it nearby. Below the topsoil, he hit harder ground, a mixture of small rocks and compacted dirt. This was more difficult, but still manageable. After digging down approximately 2 feet, he reached clay. The clay was dense and heavy, requiring significant effort to break apart with the shovel. Each shovelful was thick and sticky, clinging to the blade and requiring scraping to remove. Henry dug for 6 hours that first day, creating a hole roughly 4 feet square and 3 feet deep. By evening, his hands were blistered and his back ached from the repeated bending and lifting. He was not accustomed to this type of sustained physical labor. Trapping and hunting required walking long distances and occasional bursts of intense effort, but not the repetitive strain of continuous digging. He slept poorly that night, his muscles protesting every movement. The second day, he continued digging, going deeper into the clay layer. At 4 feet deep, he reached down and felt the clay at the bottom of his pit. It was noticeably cooler than the surface, but not as cold as he had hoped. He kept digging. At 5 feet deep, the temperature difference was more pronounced. The clay was cold enough to be uncomfortable to touch for extended periods. Henry decided to test his 5-foot-deep pit before digging any further. He wrapped a piece of the remaining edible venison in canvas and placed it at the bottom of the hole. Then he covered the pit with several planks he had left over from building his cabin and piled dirt and grass on top of the planks to block sunlight and insulate the opening. The air temperature that day reached 92 degrees. After 24 hours, he uncovered the pit and retrieved the wrapped venison. The meat was cool to the touch and showed no signs of spoilage. After 48 hours, the meat was still good. After 4 days, it remained fresh, while an identical piece left in his cabin had begun to smell and discolor. The experiment was encouraging but not conclusive. 4 days was better than nothing, but Henry needed storage that would preserve food for weeks or months, not days. He suspected the problem was that his pit was not deep enough. The clay at 5 feet was cooler than the surface, but perhaps the truly stable cold zone was deeper. He resumed digging, pushing the pit down to 6 feet. then 7 feet. At 7 feet deep, something changed. The clay at the bottom was genuinely cold, cold enough that standing in the pit for more than a few minutes made him shiver despite the summer heat above ground. He ran another test, this time with both meat and vegetables. He placed wrapped venison, several potatoes, and a bundle of wild onions at the bottom of the 7-foot pit, covered everything, and waited. After 1 week, all the food remained in perfect condition. After 2 weeks, the meat showed no spoilage, and the vegetables were still firm and fresh. After 3 weeks, everything was still edible. Henry had found the depth that mattered. 7 feet down in clay soil, the temperature remained stable regardless of surface conditions. Over the next month, Henry refined his system through continued experimentation. He discovered that the pit's shape mattered. His initial square pit had corners where air circulation was poor. He modified the design, creating a rectangular pit approximately 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 7 feet deep. The rectangular shape provided better organization of stored items and improved air movement. He learned that drainage was critical. Even 7 feet underground, water could seep through clay during heavy rain. He dug a small sump at one end of the pit, a depression 6 inches deeper than the main floor, where any water would collect and could be bailed out. Ventilation became his next focus. Completely sealing the pit trapped moisture from the food itself, creating condensation that encouraged mold growth. He drilled several holes through his plank covering and inserted hollow reeds to allow air exchange while keeping out rain and insects. The ventilation prevented moisture buildup without significantly warming the interior. He experimented with different covering methods, eventually settling on a system of thick planks covered with canvas, then a layer of dirt, then sod. This multi-layer approach provided insulation, waterproofing, and camouflage. By late September 1839, Henry had constructed what he considered his final design. The pit measured 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 7 feet deep at its main level, with an additional 6-inch sump at one end for drainage. The walls were smooth clay, carefully shaped with his shovel to prevent loose material from falling into the storage area. He had learned that rough walls shed small amounts of clay constantly, contaminating stored food. Smoothing the walls took extra time but eliminated this problem. Access was through a vertical shaft rather than a sloped entrance. A sloped entrance would have been easier to climb in and out of, but it also would have allowed warm air to flow down into the pit. Henry wanted to trap the cold air at the bottom. He built a ladder from pine saplings lashed together with leather strips, providing a way to climb down and retrieve food without compromising the pit's temperature stability. The ladder was permanent, left in place and leaning against one wall. The covering system was sophisticated for frontier construction. The base layer consisted of 8 thick planks hewn from pine logs, each plank approximately 3 inches thick, 12 inches wide, and 7 feet long. The planks fit together tightly, with minimal gaps between them. Henry had carved tongue and groove joints along the edges, so each plank interlocked with its neighbors. This prevented warping from creating openings large enough for animals to exploit. Over the planks, he stretched a large piece of canvas he had purchased at the trading post specifically for this purpose. The canvas was heavy duck cloth, waterproofed with a mixture of linseed oil and pine tar he had boiled together. Over the canvas, he piled 6 inches of dirt, tamping it down firmly. The dirt provided thermal mass that further stabilized temperature and protected the canvas from damage. Over the dirt, he laid strips of sod cut from the surrounding grassland. Within a few weeks, the grass would root and grow, making the entire covering blend seamlessly with the surrounding ground. From 10 feet away, the covered pit was nearly invisible. Only someone who knew exactly where to look would notice the slight rectangular rise that marked its location. Inside the pit, Henry built organization systems. He constructed simple shelves from flat stones stacked in columns with thin planks laid across them. The shelves created multiple levels of storage, maximizing the pit's capacity. He designated different areas for different food types. Wrapped meats went on the upper shelves where air circulation was best. Root vegetables went directly on the clay floor where humidity was highest. Dried foods went in sealed containers on middle shelves. He learned through experience that certain foods could not be stored together. Onions, if placed near potatoes, would cause the potatoes to sprout prematurely. Strong-smelling foods like dried fish would contaminate other items if not properly sealed. The entire project, from initial concept to finished construction, took 6 weeks and cost Henry approximately $30 in materials, primarily for canvas, rope, and a few iron hooks he mounted in the pit walls for hanging items. The real test came in December 1839. Henry had spent October and November hunting successfully, taking advantage of the fall elk migration through his area. He had harvested 3 elk and 4 deer, far more meat than he could possibly consume before spring. In previous years, this would have created an impossible preservation problem. He would have been forced to smoke or salt everything immediately, a process that would have taken weeks and consumed his entire salt supply. Instead, he simply wrapped the meat in canvas, lowered it into his pit, and stored it on the upper shelves he had built. By mid-December, temperatures dropped below zero at night. The creeks froze solid. Snow accumulated to depths of 3 feet in some areas around his cabin. Traditional food storage methods became unpredictable during extreme cold. Smoked meat hanging in an unheated cabin would freeze solid, which preserved it but made it difficult to cut portions for cooking. Meat stored outside would be accessible to wolves and other predators desperate for food during harsh winter. Henry's pit, buried under snow and insulated by frozen earth, maintained its steady temperature. He descended into the pit every few days to retrieve food. The latter was sometimes slippery with frost, but the pit interior remained remarkably stable. The temperature 7 feet underground never fluctuated more than a few degrees, regardless of surface conditions. When the air temperature outside was 15 below zero, the pit remained around 40 degrees. When a brief warming spell in January brought temperatures above freezing for several days, the pit stayed cool. Henry realized he had discovered something profound. Underground at sufficient depth, temperature was almost completely independent of surface weather. The meat stored in his pit remained fresh throughout the entire winter. In February, he retrieved venison that he had stored in October, more than 4 months earlier. The meat showed no freezer burn, no discoloration, no spoilage of any kind. It was as fresh as the day he had killed the deer. His root vegetables, stored on the pit floor, remained firm and edible. Potatoes that would have sprouted or rotted in his cabin lasted months in the cool, humid environment of the pit floor. Carrots stayed crisp. Even wild onions remained usable far longer than traditional storage methods allowed. Other trappers occasionally passed through Henry's area during the winter, following trap lines or traveling between camps. Henry offered hospitality as frontier custom required, sharing food and shelter with travelers. These visitors invariably commented on the quality of Henry's food supplies. Fresh meat in February was unusual. Most trappers were eating heavily salted jerky or dried pemmican by midwinter, foods that were nutritious but nearly tasteless and difficult to chew. Henry served them venison that was tender and flavorful, vegetables that had not shriveled, spoiled. When they asked how he managed such stores, he explained his pit system. Some were skeptical, others were intrigued. A few asked to see the pit itself. Henry showed them willingly, explaining the depth requirements, the clay soil necessity, and the covering techniques he had developed. Word traveled slowly in the scattered trapping community, but it traveled. By spring 1840, several trappers who had visited Henry's camp during winter began constructing their own storage pits. A trapper named Douglas Bennett, who operated about 20 miles north of Henry's cabin, was the first. Bennett had spent one night at Henry's camp in January and had been impressed by both the quality of Henry's food stores and the simplicity of the storage method. In March, as soon as the ground thawed enough to dig, Bennett started his own pit. Bennett made mistakes that Henry had already learned to avoid. His first pit was only 5 feet deep, not reaching the stable cold zone, food stored. There lasted longer than surface storage but still spoiled within weeks. Bennett dug deeper, eventually reaching 7 feet, and found the same temperature stability Henry had discovered. Bennett also initially neglected drainage, resulting in a flooded pit after the first heavy spring rain. He added a sump system similar to Henry's design, solving the problem. By May, Bennett had a functional cold storage pit and was enthusiastically telling other trappers about the technique. The innovation spread through practical demonstration rather than any formal instruction. Trappers who saw the pits and tasted food stored in them became converts. They built their own versions, adapted the design to their specific locations and needs, and shared their results with others. Some modifications improved the original concept. A trapper named Thomas Webb discovered that lining the pit walls with flat stones prevented clay from gradually eroding and contaminating food. Another trapper named Jack Morrison developed a rope and pulley system that made lowering and raising heavy items much easier than climbing the ladder while carrying supplies. The technique had limitations that became apparent as more people attempted it. Not all soil types worked equally well. Sandy soil could not maintain structural integrity at 7-foot depths. The walls would collapse without extensive reinforcement. Rocky soil was extremely difficult to dig by hand. A man might spend weeks excavating a pit in rocky ground. The ideal soil was clay, or clay mixed with some sandy loam for easier digging. Trappers in areas without suitable soil could not use the method, though some attempted to create above-ground equivalents using thick stone walls and earth-covered roofs. These structures worked moderately well but never achieved the temperature stability of true underground pits. Location mattered significantly. Pits dug in low-lying areas where water naturally collected would flood repeatedly and become unusable. Pits dug on slopes needed careful consideration of drainage patterns. The ideal location was slightly elevated ground with good natural drainage. Proximity to the cabin was convenient, but pits dug too close could undermine foundation logs. Most successful builders placed their pits 20 to 50 yards from their main structures. By 1841, what trappers were calling marsh pits had become relatively common in the northern Rocky Mountain region. Not every trapper built one, but those who did consistently reported dramatic improvements in food preservation and winter survival rates. The impact of Henry's innovation extended beyond the trapping community. As the fur trade continued its decline through the 1840s, many former trappers transitioned to other frontier occupations. Some became guides for wagon trains. Others established trading posts or small ranches. A few became prospectors when gold discoveries began drawing thousands west. These men carried their knowledge of cold storage pits into new contexts and shared it with the waves of settlers who followed. Homesteaders arriving in Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho territories during the 1850s and 60s discovered that standard root cellars, which worked adequately in more temperate eastern climates, were often insufficient for the extreme temperature swings of the Mountain West. Summers could reach 100 degrees. Winters could drop to 30 below zero. Food storage structures needed to handle both extremes. Former trappers who had built or used marsh pits introduced the technique to farming communities. The deep clay pit design proved ideal for homestead food storage. Settlers modified the basic concept for agricultural use. Farm families needed to store larger quantities and greater varieties of food than solitary trappers. They built bigger pits, some measuring 10 feet by 12 feet and 8 feet deep. They added permanent stone steps instead of ladders for easier access. They constructed more elaborate covering systems with hinged doors and proper framing. Some families built small structures over their pits, creating what looked like tiny sheds but were actually entrance buildings for underground storage chambers. The fundamental principle remained unchanged. Dig deep enough into clay soil to reach stable cold temperatures, ensure proper drainage and ventilation, and protect the opening from weather and animals. The technique saved lives during harsh winters and drought years. Families who had adequate cold storage could preserve meat from fall butchering through the entire winter and into spring. They could store root vegetables harvested in autumn and still have edible food in March or April when supplies typically ran lowest. During years when crops failed or hunting was poor, the ability to preserve what little food was available made the difference between survival and starvation. Historical records from Montana and Wyoming territories include multiple accounts of families surviving difficult winters specifically because their underground storage kept food from spoiling. By 1860, the technique had spread beyond the mountain regions. Settlers in eastern Montana and the Dakotas, where clay soil was common and temperature extremes were severe, adopted underground cold storage as standard practice. Some farmers in Kansas and Nebraska built similar structures. The design worked anywhere that had suitable soil and significant temperature variations. The specific dimensions varied based on local soil conditions and family needs, but the principle of deep clay storage remained constant across different implementations. Henry Marsh himself left the mountains in 1844. He had saved enough money to purchase land in Oregon Territory and start the small ranch he had always planned. He married a widow named Catherine Reynolds in 1846 and spent the next 25 years raising cattle and 4 children in the Willamette Valley. Henry never built another storage pit after leaving Montana. The Willamette Valley had a mild climate where traditional root cellars worked adequately, and by the time he established his ranch, commercial ice harvesting was becoming available in larger towns. He rarely spoke about his trapping years. His children knew their father had lived in the mountains before settling in Oregon, but he shared few details. The innovation that had spread across the frontier and saved countless lives was simply something he had done to solve a practical problem. He saw no reason to claim credit or seek recognition. Catherine died in 1868 after a brief illness. Henry continued managing the ranch with help from his 2 sons until arthritis made physical labor increasingly difficult. He sold the ranch in 1870 and moved to Salem, Oregon, where his daughter lived with her family. He spent his final years in relative comfort, a quiet man who read newspapers, played with his grandchildren, and occasionally attended Methodist church services. He died in his sleep in March 1872 at age 60. The obituary in the Salem newspaper identified him as a retired rancher and former mountain man. It made no mention of cold storage pits or food preservation techniques. Back in the Montana mountains, Henry had left nearly 30 years earlier. His original pit still existed. The cabin had collapsed in the 1850s, its logs rotting and roof caving in as untended structures inevitably did. But 7 feet underground, the clay pit remained structurally sound. Subsequent inhabitants of the area had discovered and used it. A prospector in the 1860s stored supplies there during a winter spent searching for gold in the nearby streams. A hunting party in the 1870s used it to preserve elk meat during an extended stay. The pit required occasional maintenance, clearing debris, and repairing the covering. But the fundamental structure needed no rebuilding. Similar pits scattered across the northern Rockies and Mountain West territories served their builders and subsequent users for decades. Some remained functional into the early 20th century, long after commercial refrigeration had become common in towns and cities. Remote ranches and isolated homesteads continued using underground cold storage because it worked, required no mechanical maintenance, and cost nothing to operate once built. The technique became so standard in some regions that people forgot it had ever been an innovation. It was simply how things were done, like notching logs or building stone fireplaces. Henry Marsh never knew his technique's full impact. He never learned how many people built pits based on his design or how many lives were extended by food that stayed fresh because of storage methods he had developed. He died believing he had solved a personal problem adequately and shared the solution with a few fellow trappers. The historical reality was far more significant. A man desperate to preserve spoiled meat had accidentally discovered principles of thermal mass and stable underground temperatures that would influence frontier architecture and food storage for generations. The clay that had nearly killed him through starvation became the material that saved him and hundreds of others who followed his example into the unforgiving mountain wilderness.